respond with feedback and your own opinions as well as questions. So, as I said, I work with the ATLAS experiment. It's an experiment with thousands of people and many, many different tasks that need to be performed. And this is a recent snapshot of a workshop that we held for machine learning in ATLAS. I won't go through each of the contributions, but basically they fall into around 40 different applications, which you can break down into a series of tasks. And each task has a clear input and a clear output that you want to perform. And in general, these tasks have the following in common, that they all take as input point clouds. That seems to be a pretty common recurring theme in high energy physics. So point cloud is simply a set of vectors. Now those vectors don't all need to be the same. In fact, they can be different data types amongst the point cloud. And in this sense, we call them a heterogeneous point cloud. They can be in 3D space, but they can be in space-time, or in fact have any number of arbitrary features. So that could be energy deposits, direction, shape, or hand-engineered features that domain experts create. So here's an example of just a toy cloud that we generated, which is hits in layers of a detector, and you can see the structure there. Begs the question, how do you actually consume a point cloud in a machine learning model? There's probably a myriad of ways, but I think they fall into three main categories. So the first is called deep sets. Now this basically takes the constraint that we want permutation invariance in the set, meaning that if we change the order of the point clouds that they're consumed, we don't want our output to change. So this was proposed in 2016, I think, by Zahir et al. And the idea here is that you take your set of points in the cloud, you pass them through multi-layer perceptrons or feed-forward networks, so black box models that can learn any function sensibly, and then we aggregate them in some way. So we sum them or take the mean or the max, pass that information through another MLP, and we get our classification or regression or whatever your task is. So you can see that changing the order of these points shouldn't change the output. That's nice. On the other end, we can use a transformer, which basically adds in a couple of features that we didn't have with deep sets. So for example, now each of the points are passed through MLPs, but now they're actually able to communicate with each other before the final aggregation. So in the case of a transformer, that communication is fully connected. Every point can see and talk to every other point, and it can pay attention to every other point. And that means that naively, transformers tend to scale with order n squared, n is the number of points in the cloud. And then somewhere in between, or interpolating between the two, is a graph neural network where each point can pay attention to some arbitrary number of other points that we define how the points are connected. And then again, they pay attention to each other using some message passing, and then we aggregate those messages around each point and then produce our output. Now the scaling behavior of this is not clear, right? I mean, the number of points and E is the number of edges, and the performance of the graph neural network scales depending on the particular architecture that you choose. And it's an open secret that GNNs are one generalized form of a transformer. This has been well discussed in literature. In fact, I've put a GitHub link there to a notebook that I made, if you're curious, where I basically reframe the same problem with a GNN and a transformer and get the same output. So that's not. So in that sense, this distribution from left to right is really scaling or interpolating from no message passing or no information transferred between points to any kind of information to be transferred between any 2 points. So that's some of the architectures that we can use to consume point clouds. And in general, this is the sort of state of the art of point clouds in high energy physics. Now, I'm not saying this is the same for every domain in high energy physics or every group in high energy physics, but this tends to be the landscape. Typically, you work with a single scale, meaning that we might have a track reconstruction group, and they work with hits in a detector. Then they create their tracks and they pass it to a particle ID group, for example, and and they use tracks, moving up in scale, moving up in granularity. So each group usually uses the granularity that they're interested in. Similarly, we tend to have one model per task. So we have an ID group, or a tagging group, or a tracking group, and they each train their own model that is best suited to that task. And because transformers, as we know, scale naively, n squared, then we tend to be limited by the number of points we can consume. Maybe 1,000 points is doable for a tagging problem. Once we start to get to 10,000 points, 100,000 points, our scaling quickly gets out of control. Again, this is not every domain in physics, but this tends to be the sort of the trend. So let me compare that with other domains in science. So clearly, the most obvious application of machine learning to point cloud data is transformers in large language models. I'll get it out of the way and say that GPT, ChatGPT, GPT-4, these are inspiring models that would be nice to apply their success to the fields of physics and other sciences. And there have indeed been efforts to apply these techniques to scientific domains. So, for example, biological language models have seen great success in encoding DNA and proteins. The problem there is that they have a clear sequential structure. Whereas in physics, we don't necessarily have a sequential structure, we have a cloud. Okay, so maybe we can look at chemistry, which maybe is a better template. Typically you have molecules, which are not a sequence, but they tend to be points in space. Okay, but even then there is typically a structure already, which is the bonds between molecules. So it's not a perfect map from chemistry to physics. So I want to plant the seed of what could a physics language model look like. And I'll sort of skip to the end and say that basically each of the trends that we see currently in physics, meaning single scale, single task, small capacity, we want to kind of fix those or overcome those challenges. We want to be able to include multiple scales, multiple granularity, sort of a hierarchical structure. We want to be able to do multiple tasks with the same model, and we want basically, endlessly scalable capacity. That would be nice. Can we go to hundreds of thousands or millions of points? So I gave this seminar a couple of days ago at MIT and got some interesting objections that I want to get ahead of, right, before we dive further. So it makes perfect sense, I think, to ask, why do we care? Isn't this a waste of resources? Just because something worked for language, why would we think it works for physics? So I just want to plant some ideas that I think are not the full answer, but that there are some links in there that you can follow up. I think we have good reasons to think that low-level information, meaning very small granularity, the smallest units of information, can actually impact the highest levels of information. So for example, in tracking, which I will sort of dive deeply into in a minute, we use the lowest level cluster information, meaning the specific energy readings and the cluster shapes, and that actually helps the high-level track finding, which currently is not used in sort of traditional algorithms. We also have good reason to think that training a model with multiple tasks can actually improve the single task performance, that there are emergent patterns that a model gets better at if it sees multiple different tasks. GPT is not trained just on shopping lists and haikus, it's trained on a wide variety of data and a wide variety of tasks. And there are a couple links there that apply this in physics. And okay, the final one is not a hard and fast evidence, but I suspect that other tasks that we have in physics that aren't clearly just classification and regression, but more exotic tasks like anomaly detection, generative models, I suspect these will benefit from having multitask and multi-scale representations. And we see that in large language models as well. So let me put that there, but feel free to ask questions and push on that point if you're curious. So now I want to dive into a project that we work on with Exatrkx and a couple other groups around Europe and the States. So this is called GNN for ITK, and it's based on the fact that the Large Hadron Collider is going to be upgraded to something called the High Luminosity Large Hadron Collider that will start in 2029, fingers crossed. And the idea is that having high luminosity allows greater access to new physics, for example, supersymmetry or new resonances, but also better precision on the physics that we already know about. So it's an interesting problem to go to high luminosity, and in fact, there's a lot of tasks that need to be solved in a high luminosity LHC. Vertex reconstruction, jet tagging, these are all tasks that I mentioned earlier that we're using machine learning for. But they all have in common that they need accurate track reconstruction. Track reconstruction is the task of taking a series of hits or energy deposits that have been left by particles, and we want to reconstruct the tracks that those particles moved in. So we see a kind of a toy here in the image. It's pretty obvious almost by eye, and in fact in the old days, people did this by eye. You actually sat down with bubble chambers and so on and reconstructed it by eye. But today we have hundreds of thousands of hits, and it's impossible to do it by eye, and it's becoming intractable to do it traditionally with combinatorial algorithms. It's still possible, but the scaling of those algorithms makes us look for other solutions, for example, in machine learning. So our group, GNN for ITK, suggests that using a graph representation is a natural way of representing the tracking problem. So here we have nodes, which are the energy deposits in the tracks. We have edges between those nodes, which represent whether a particle traveled between those nodes or not. And those edges can be true or false. We say they're true if the particle actually did travel from one point to point, and they're false if those two hits were left by different particles. So again, here is that toy point cloud. We can say, okay, let's ab initio connect all the hits in some sort of silly intuitive way, and then we want to apply a graph neural network to classify the edges as either coming from the same particle or from a different particle. And then we can post-process those. So as you can see, this is an actual event. There are hundreds of thousands of hits in there, so it's quite hard to see, but I've just pulled out some of the particles and connected them. The HL LHC in a few years will be about 5 or 7 times more hits than the current Atlas detector and CMS detector. And the problem is that traditional reconstruction algorithms scale at least quadratically, and in the naive case, combinatorially, which is not a great thing when we are scaling the number of points. So as I said, our task is we want to apply graph neural networks to the ITK detector. The ITK detector is the inner tracker, so there's an image here of that tracker planned to be built for the HL-LHC. There are 2 groups that are working on this project. There's Exatrkx, which is a project that is a collaboration between institutes in the US, and L2IT, which is a laboratory in Toulouse in France. And we've been working together to apply GNN, or track reconstruction. So we've come up with this prototype, which basically takes your set of hits, it produces a graph in some way, and there are a few different ways to do that. It applies a GNN to classify the edges as true or false. Given those predictions, we need to do something, some kind of hand-engineered process to split up that graph into a set of track candidates that we try and match to the real particles. So the first stage is building a graph. A couple of ways to do this. One is a sort of physics intuitive or data-driven way, where basically we take the smallest unit in our detector, which is a module, and we ask the question, well, can module A and module B be connected with a particle? And we look at all the particles that travel through the detector, millions of particles from simulation, and we create a big map of which modules can be connected by a particle. And then when we perform it in inference, we do it the opposite direction. We look at all the modules that could be connected, and we build our graphs in that way. Another way of doing it is to actually learn that map with ML, with a multi-layer perceptron. So we can embed all the hits in our detector into some latent space. In this case, I think these images are from a 12-dimensional space that we've projected down to 2D. You can see the red crosses here represent a track. And when they're embedded into that space, the goal is for those hits to be embedded close together. So the way you do this is something called metric learning. Basically, you take pairs of samples. So, for example, we have a picture of a cat and a dog, and we embed those into a space. Now, we know a cat and a dog are different classes, so we want to repel those two points away from each other in that space. And then we take a true pair, two cats, for example, we want to attract them in that space. So hopefully once we've finished our training, we have all the cats clustered into one space and all the dogs clustered into a different space. The nice thing about this is we don't need to know how many classes there are. We can have 2 classes or 1 million classes, and the metric learning still scales the same way in some sense, because it's only pairwise true or false. And so the idea is we embed into this space, we perform a radius graph construction, meaning that around each point, we look at all the other points in a radius of R, and then we connect our graph in that way. And this turns out to work quite well. Once we've built our graph, then we want to apply our graphical network. Now, there are, more graphical network architectures than you can shake a stick at, so we chose one that is, in some ways, I think, a very general architecture called an interaction network that was created by Battaglia et al. In 2016. So the idea is we embed the node features, meaning the hit features, encode them, and then we aggregate those features around each edge and pass those through edge networks. So we basically have the most general way of passing information from one node to another. And this happens over a series of, say, 6, 7, 8 message passing steps. And you can see in the GIF there that each step improves the performance of the network, which is kind of like convolutions in an image, right? But to a non-grid structure, a graph-like structure. So at some point we say, okay, that's good enough. We stop passing messages and we take the predictions for each edge. And then the final step is to take those predictions and produce track candidates. So there are a couple of ways to do this as well. One is a sort of simple, intuitive way. We just throw away all the edges below some threshold, and then we connect all the remaining edges. And all the hits that are connected by edges, we call track number 1. All the hits connected from some other number of edges, we call track number 2, and so on. Now, this is super fast. It scales with the number of nodes. It's very parallelizable. It basically allows us to do sort of order of millisecond graph construction. However, it sort of ignores our physics intuition, right? We should think of a track as progressing sequentially from the inside of the detector outwards. So we can use that intuition to do a path-based walkthrough algorithm. Start with each node, and then we walk in the direction of the edges, choosing at each node which edge to follow. And okay, this is slower. It scales with the number of edges, and it needs a directed graph, but in general, it performs better because it fits our intuition. And at the end of the day, we get quite nice performance. So these are some public results that we published last year. You can see the red lines are the conventional matching that Atlas uses to produce tracking efficiency. So this is how many of the particles in the detector did we actually reconstruct. And you can see we get 98, 99% of those tracks reconstructed. And this is competitive with traditional algorithms. And the nice thing is that we know that it scales better. So here we have a scaling of the number of space points, and okay, we've suggestively drawn a line that is linear, but in reality, the scaling is probably slightly more than linear, but it appears to be less than quadratic, which is exciting. And you can see that when we first started this project, each event took around 15 seconds to reconstruct. Through a lot of hard work and elbow grease, we've got it down to less than 1 second, which is kind of our target. Can we reconstruct each event in less than 1 second? And there were a range of optimizations we had to make for this. One of the ones that I'm quite curious about that I'll return to in a minute is how do you construct a graph from a point cloud? And as I said, we use this radius graph, meaning that we connect all hits within a certain radius of each node. And that turns out to scale much better than the algorithm that people are most used to building graphs with, which is a KNN, a k-nearest neighbor algorithm. So using kind of the state-of-the-art KNN, which is created by Facebook, called Phase, you can construct your graph in around 700 milliseconds. But we worked with an engineer in Zurich who had created this really nice package using a fixed radius nearest neighbor, and was able to reduce that by over an order of magnitude. And it scales. So we know as the size of the point cloud increases, we get better scaling than the KNN algorithm. So suddenly that puts large graph construction in the ballpark of these kind of problems. So okay, that was just a deep dive into an example of a task that we can solve with graph networks and point clouds. But again, I want to return to this picture of that was a single scale, it was a single task, and okay, maybe we've solved this small capacity problem. Again, we only used a single granularity, which is energy deposits of the clusters. At the moment, it's a single task, which is track reconstruction. And okay, we think we have got a better handle on basically applying a GNN to 300,000 points, but we cheated, right? I mean, we had an explicit physics intuition for how to construct the graph. What if we don't know how hits should be connected? I think of this as a topology problem that we'll return to in a second, but basically we have still not moved to this multi-scale, multitask paradigm. So let's break down each of those three dreams of multi-scale, multitask, and large capacity. So one is, can we include different scales in our point cloud? So in this case, it would be nice if we had both cluster level, hit level, and also track level node information, so that we were able to create some sort of new multi-scale group in a physics reconstruction who had access to all of these different hierarchy of data. Because we have a physical intuition that there are features that emerge at each granularity. And energy deposits, clusters, and space points, partons, particles, event sets. I mean, a physics analysis really has a huge hierarchy of different data types. And of course, we could simply put them by hand, but it would be nice if our model could learn the scales that are most relevant to a problem, right? So we've tried to do this with something that has already existed in literature called a hierarchical graph neural network that we've applied to the tracking problem that tries to do tracking, basically that the graph construction, edge classification, and track building that I described previously. Can we do all of that in a single step? So that required creating a new fully differentiable pooling operation, which basically takes our typical flat GNN and allows for the possibility of track-like nodes in the point cloud. So now we have hit-like nodes and track-like nodes, and messages are able to be passed between hits and tracks. And it works really nicely. So you can see that our tracking efficiency is higher and our fake rate is lower. And in fact, it's actually a little bit faster than the previous model that we were using, which just had hit-level information. We can also include different types of data in this heterogeneous node types, and there are a couple examples there as well. So okay, now we can include different scales of data, but how can we apply them to different tasks? So I want to look towards large language models here, which can capture a single common representation for many different tasks. And a really nice paradigm that we found for this is the processor idea, which comes from a group at DeepMind, which the idea here is, given a single central common model, we can switch out the encoders and decoders depending on the task that we're trying to solve. In this case, this paper, a generalist neural algorithmic learner by the group at DeepMind, the idea was to solve a variety of different graph optimization problems. So graph segmentation, traveling salesmen, all these problems that have been solved over the last 100 years by sweat and blood and tears, by like computer scientists. Now they threw all of these tasks in a single model. Okay, they switched out the encoder and decoder, but the same central model tried to solve all of these graph optimization problems. And they found that they could produce a model which was able to perform as well, a multitasking model that performed as well as the single task models. So they had about 30 different tasks that this model was able to solve. And we're collaborating with that group to apply that concept to a model that can predict tracks and also predict the parameters in the tracks in the same step. And I have some very, very early results for that, so take them, with a moderate-sized grain of salt. But basically, the idea is, can we use our metric learning, meaning can we embed our hits into a space, and at the same time use a different decoder to take those clusters of hits and predict the transverse momentum of all the hits in that cluster, using the same core GNN, so not changing the weights between them. And it turns out that without using embedding, we get a resolution of around 120 MeV. Using the embedding, we get a better resolution, meaning a smaller absolute error. So that's quite nice, and we can think of this as a sort of auxiliary task that helps the model learn what the PT should be. The nice thing is that we can turn off the embedding task over time. We can fade it out, and we still retain our original good performance of the PT. So in this way, we can think of this as a kind of hint. We want to prime the model with some physical intuition, and then once it's learned that, we can turn it off and remove that task. So that's the second goal, which we have some early work on. But the sort of elephant in the room is, how do we actually scale these to hundreds of thousands of points, millions of points, tens of millions of points? We've probably all heard that OpenAI has made billions of dollars by scaling to around 32,000 points, and that's sort of the state of the art for a transformer. I can see that it would take several years before we're able to scale that up to another order or two of magnitude. So my intuition is that we probably shouldn't be using dense point cloud message passing, meaning transformers. We should probably use sparse point cloud message passing. But that begs the question, how do you construct a topology or a graph in which the points should communicate if you don't have any physical intuition about what that graph should be? That's a tricky problem. And I think the solution is given by a beautiful architecture created by a group at the CMS experiments called Grabnet. Such an elegant solution to this problem, which basically learns an embedding space where the distance between any two neighbors is exactly the attention that they should pay to each other. So if two neighbors are close, then they should communicate strongly. If they're distant, then they shouldn't communicate at all. So it's learning a metric for the topology. And basically, your final loss function should therefore propagate back the information that puts nodes close together into that space. I mean, a beautiful, beautiful solution. We found when we applied this architecture to the tracking problem that actually there were two ways that nodes could communicate. One was by being close to each other, but the other one was by being large or loud, meaning that their features were very strong or large. So it actually meant that a very large node, for example, 4 here in the original Grabnet attention mechanism, was able to communicate very strongly, but that meant that nodes that were far away could still pay attention to it. Now, I know this is all getting a little bit in the weeds, but basically the point is that we don't want that. We want that space to only communicate by distance, because that distance is how we're going to construct the graph in the first place. So the solution is in our case, was embarrassingly simple. We just normalize all the node sizes and then build the graph using our radius nearest neighbor algorithm. And that improved the performance quite a bit, and it meant that we were able to use our RNN, our radius nearest neighbor, rather than a KNN, which we know scales worse. And so you can see that the Grabnet norm is able to tag jets. In this case, we applied it to a jet tagging problem in around 22 microseconds per jet, compared to the sort of state-of-the-art particle net, which was around 88 microseconds per jet, and took an order of magnitude less in memory to do it. That's one step in the direction of how do you construct a graph when you don't know what that graph should represent. But the task is not finished. there are many things I think that are missing from physics language model. We need more tasks. At the moment, we have a small set of data sets and tasks that we're able to solve. But as I said, we know that GPT is not trained with 2 or 3 tasks. It's trained on, all of Wikipedia, all of Reddit, which inherently contains a wide variety of different data types. And there's some work on this that already has been done and is really, really nice. JetNet, for example, takes different data sets and different evaluation techniques. The energy flow package has a variety of also jet data sets. We should keep doing this and scale it to 20, 30, 40 different tasks. I mean, that original list of tasks that I gave at the start, we should have data sets for all of those tasks that are compatible with a single model. We need, I think, a truly scalable point cloud message passing. I mean, this idea is quite nice, but at the moment, it only fits on 1 GPU. We don't have a way of splitting this model across GPUs at the moment. We're working with a group at Georgia Tech to do that, to adapt their pipe GCN and their DNS GCN, which is a way of distributing a graph neural network across GPUs. And just to dig into that point a little bit further, I think the problem is that current industry is focused on distributing a model across GPUs. Right? If you think about Facebook or OpenAI, they have a large model, I mean, billions of parameters. But their context window is quite small. It's thousands of tokens. So they're interested in splitting the model. We, on the other hand, have a huge point cloud, but our models are actually not that big. So we want to split our point cloud. It seems simple. You should be able to do one rather than the other. But for one reason or another, there hasn't been a concerted effort to be able to split a point cloud. And we need, I think, a rigorous way of building generative models for point cloud message passing. There's some really nice work in this direction using generative adversarial networks for point clouds. I think there's a lot more to be done. And we also need a way of getting a handle on uncertainties. Particle physics is famous for having really precise understandings of the systematic and experimental and theoretical uncertainties in a problem. That all kind of comes out in the wash when you use these black boxes. It's a trade-off. They get extremely good accuracy, but then we lose our physics intuition about how they work, right? And so we can't clearly point to where the uncertainties are. So I'll leave it there. I mean, there's been a huge amount of work from different HEP communities to build all of these pieces. And certainly we're not the only group doing it. There are many groups that are keen to solve this problem because we can see in language and biology and chemistry, they work really, really well when all the pieces are in place. But in physics, at least, I think the final pieces are both a combination of person power and also creativity. There are genuine novel problems still to be solved. But I hope that they will be solved in the next couple of years, and for sure, the HEP community seems very excited to embrace them once they're ready. So I'll leave it there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I want to open up the chat for any questions. Feel free to drop any messages in the chat, but I also want to hand it over to Savannah, who came in a little late. So do you want to kick us off?
This question?
Yeah, do you have a question?
Well, I missed the first 20 minutes. But I was writing. I mean, what other tasks do you think I don't know, we should be including in this language model approach besides, I guess, generation?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of pointed towards this before you came in, which there are a huge number of tasks amongst a huge number of different communities, and a lot of those communities have different data structures that they work with. They have different language for often overlapping algorithms in those tasks. And for sure, I'm not saying it's simple to combine these tasks because they require different domain expertise, right? So for sure, generation is a big one. that needs a really rigorous solution, and for sure you can do this with transformers, but that scaling gets worse, you know, and if we want to generate a point cloud with more than a few hundred points, the problem starts to get out of control if you use transformers. So yeah, I think generation anomaly detection as well is quite a exciting application of these kind of point, sort of the physics language model.
So my rough understanding of LLMs is they're trained mostly on just text completion, right? And then you kind of get this emergent behavior of performance on different types of NLP and NLU benchmarking tasks. So do you think that's the approach here? Is we define some very general kind of task and make a super big GNN and then see if it does these other tasks, or is there a way to actually combine them into, I don't think I've ever seen more than 2 or 3 tasks combined in a single loss function.
Yeah, I think you're right, the kind of unsupervised approach where you're just doing a fill in the blank appears to work really nicely for LLMs. Although, to be fair, I pointed to, there is some work in this point 3 here, which is training LLMs with multiple tasks. And they appear to do better than just a single task training. That's curious. I think that's early work, and I think there's more to discover there. And you could probably apply this in physics as well. The elephant in that room is that how do you do fill in the blank for points in 3D space? I think there are some interesting ideas that actually I've just come across in the last few days, which is, can you break your 3D space into, for example, a grid? Can you do a kind of create a basis?
Back to grid?
Yeah, maybe. Okay, but in this case, it's not voxelized. You could create a basis using, radial basis function or some sort of kerneling with Gaussians, where you're still able to return back to a genuine mapping from your 3D space to your grid and back, rather than just voxelizing or pixelizing your space and losing the information. We have extremely high resolution information, right, in these detectors. It would be a shame to throw it away with just a grid. So is there can we have our cake and eat it too? Can we create a way of copying or imitating the way that large language models work, which is by, creating a finite list of tokens, right, say 1 million tokens, and we predict the class. We do a class prediction for each of those tokens. Can we imitate that approach with 3D space? Possibly. I haven't seen it done. If someone knows that it's been done, I'm keen to see it. But yeah, that for sure is awake at night. How do you do the missing word or fill in the blank, but for 3D space or 4D?
Do you have a question?
Yeah. I was going to ask that as well, but also in analogy to the LLMs, they seem to be happy to hallucinate answers that are not true or just make stuff up, basically. And in physics, when you're looking for really tiny effects for new supersymmetry, how are you going to be maybe this is putting the cart before the horse, but we built the physics language model, it works. It says we found Susie in this channel. How do we know that that's true and it didn't just make it up? How do we interpret it? How do we interrogate it?
Yeah, that's a good question. And in some ways, it's even harder than LLMs, right? Because LLMs, we have access to reality in a very intuitive way. We can look at words and we can sort of gut check them with a human brain. Whereas we don't have the perfect handle on real data from these physics collisions, right? The best we have is simulations, and we have a sophisticated mechanism of comparing simulation and data, that has decades of very smart people solving that problem. But then when you go to a black box, I feel that you lose some of those tried and tested techniques, because now there's two three parameters, right? There's how well did the black box generate the simulation, and how well does that simulation map to data? So in some ways, it's an even harder problem than LLMs, when you could have a simulating physics model, a hallucinating physics model. Yeah, and I don't think I have a good answer for it.
And I guess that's part of why right now we do everything in these tiny steps, right? Because
Right.
you can see like how the uncertainty evolves like with every transformation you do on your data, whereas it's like a one-shot thing, and it's very hard to tease apart.
Yeah, and I mean, these intuitions have been built up over like 70 years, right? Built, like breaking it into smaller chunks. And you have an expert that has spent, decades on that chunk. And that's good. I mean, I think then we should create, that shouldn't scare us away. I think we should still create these end-to-end models. A single black box does 10 steps in a single go. But then we should get even better at interrogating that model and asking it to reproduce the 10 steps somehow. And asking our domain experts, do you agree with that interpretation? That might be not the only solution, but I think that's one way of wrapping our heads around it again.
We have a question from the Zoom. Do you think these models could be used in a multi-scale GIS application for interpolating data?
GIS meaning like mapping, I guess?
GIS,
Okay.
multi-scale GIS application.
I assume, this is not my field, but I assume this is a mapping of like satellite images or something. Yeah, I don't see why not. I think there was a hierarchical like point cloud network, or GNN, that was used for resolving road networks better. I mean, it basically mapped out points of interest in a road network, and then was able to resolve them to a higher resolution, like it's a sort of super resolution road mapper. I should think that you can apply those same ideas to any kind of mapping approach. And in some ways, that is what we're doing with these tracks, right? We're building roads through space, in 3D space. And they work really well. They're able to resolve thousands and thousands of very close points and somehow solve a kind of traveling salesman problem through those tracks. Yeah, so I would think it's possible.
Do you have a question? Comment.
Well, I work in social sciences. We work in corruption networks with physics, and I'm just here learning some new ideas that we can, come up with solutions from our big network problems.
Yeah, okay. Corruption, in the sense that you corrupt the data, or that people get corrupted? Okay. Yeah. I'm used to thinking of like these LLMs are trained on like corrupting data, but I guess you can also
Actually,
corrupting
people
people.
driving each other.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah, that's challenging.
Yes. Yes, it's challenging because of the large amount of activity that happens in a network of real people interacting simultaneously, and then we're trying to come up with topography and measurements to define the closeness and the complicity of the people interacting with each other.
Okay.
If you know anything that is being applied to this, you'll be great.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't know enough about the field, but I could see that there are like adversarial problems with it, right? I mean, if you knew what the model was, you could, I guess, try and overcome the model or trick the model, deceive the model using adversarial methods. Luckily, in physics, it's just us versus nature, and hopefully nature is not adversarial. But I guess when you're working with people, if they know the model you're using, there's like a feedback loop there, right?
Oh yes, yeah. The self-restructuring and reorganization of the network is just insane.
No, that's fascinating.
Thanks.
I have a blanket question I'd like to ask all my speakers. What are some of your goals for this research? Like, where do you see it going in the next 5 years? Like, what are some use cases tangibly that your research could be applied to?
I think, what I'm excited about is just democratizing this field a bit. Because at the moment, like, okay, we have access to thousands of GPUs. That's nice, but a lot of new experiments in physics, and there are a lot of new experiments that, not every experiment is Atlas with thousands of people on it and like €1 billion budget. A lot of experiments are tabletop, or they have a very precise thing they're trying to solve. And it makes me frustrated when they go out and they have to start from scratch. And, we get, a lot of our work and time is spent with like smaller experiments. We want to get up and running quickly. These kind of models, they're trying to solve the same problem, right? Essentially, and it would be really nice if we could build models that are able to transfer from one task to another, one experiment to another, one domain to another. I mean, can we apply, particle physics, like a collider physics model for ice cube for a detection from astroparticle or something? We're working with the same basic underlying physics patterns. They should be all applicable. And every time you can apply it to a new task, you save that group, not just GPU hours, but human hours, right? And it's frustrating to build these from scratch. So that's kind of what I'm excited about, is saving people a lot of tears and time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you think, I don't know, how feasible is that, do you think? I feel like what we've been seeing in some of our other stuff that we're doing together, I personally don't have a good handle on how much, the actual experiment and the detectors affects the underlying physics. How much does it change from, the true laws of, how much is that kind of dirty by the detector? And so, is it possible to actually build a transferable model when all the experiments are maybe changing the underlying physics in a different way?
Yeah, I think that's tricky, and I don't have evidence that it's possible yet. I really like, this is kind of why I'm excited about the sort of processor idea, which is that, your central processor is hopefully just a model that understands particle physics. But you might have a Atlas encoder, a CMS encoder, an ice cube encoder, one for each detector, and then you might have different tasks that also depend on that particular physics group, whether it's detecting the direction of the neutrino shower for ice cube or reconstructing tracks in Atlas. So that might be a solution, which that encoder handles the particular geometry and materials. Again, that requires actually two very different groups sitting down and agreeing on which model to use and which language to use. That takes time, yeah.
On one of your slides, you said how many milliseconds it takes to run different algorithms. I'm pretty sure this isn't in the trigger, right? So this is offline.
Yeah.
But still, what's the time budget there, so that at the High Luminosity LHC you're not just waiting 20 years after events to have your computer put out results?
Yeah.
What's your budget, your time budget?
For offline, we have given ourselves a second on GPUs, so 1 second per event. I think that gives us a lot of buffer room, and I think we'll pretty comfortably, even with current GPUs, pretty comfortably get there. Trigger, it's maybe 3 orders of magnitude faster or more, right? We're sort of talking hundreds of microseconds maybe. And we are applying these for trigger applications. We're working with the group that will become the trigger for HL-LHC for Atlas, which is called Event Filter. We're working with them, and okay, you loosen the requirements on efficiency. You're allowed to be a little bit less efficient and pure. What can you get with that? How much speed up can you get by requiring a little bit less from your reconstruction?
That's still run on GPUs, the trigger.
Sorry?
Would the trigger machine learning stuff still run on GPUs, or would that have to be like an ASIC?
That's not yet decided. So I think that decision comes in about 18 months. So we're actually hedging our bets there. We're building models for both FPGA and CPU/GPU. I'm still a holdout on whether they can fit onto FPGAs. I know that's ongoing, yeah. But maybe you can shrink them, you can prune them, you can quantize them, you can do a lot of fun things, and maybe things that we haven't even invented yet to shrink these models down, use symmetry, constraints. There's probably a wide variety of optimizations. You can make these models. We've already seen you can make them about 1,000 times smaller just by pruning, and they still get basically the same performance. These models are hugely over-parameterized. They probably don't need most of those parameters. Does that mean we can make them faster? Yeah, I'm not sure yet. But we should try.
Well, thank you so much. I think we're just about at time, so I'm going to go ahead and close out the virtual component, but feel free to grab some bagels and coffee if you're here. Thank you so much again. It was wonderful to have you.
My pleasure.
Okay, have a great day, everyone.